Hey everyone, we're in the studio here with Pastor Ross, and today we're going to talk about transgender and what the world has to say about it and what the Bible has to say about it. But first, Ross, what exactly are we talking about when we mean transgender? There's a lot of stuff out there.
Yeah.
What are we talking about?
Let's define some terms for a second. So first of all, it starts with the term that we talk about. People talk about their biological sex or their birth sex. That's who we are by our DNA. Okay, male or female. We have 2 X chromosomes or just 1. Or we have certain hormones our body's producing, and we have different genitalia, different secondary characteristics. That's our biological sex. And for decades, for centuries, I guess or even millennia, everyone assumed that their biological sex and their gender were the same. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But in the transgender movement, they're saying that there's a distinction, and so my biological sex and my gender identity might be different. My gender identity being who I feel like or how I identify, whether I identify in my soul as being male or female. And if you're transgender, it means that your biological sex and your identified gender within are at odds with each other. They're different from each other.
Okay, that's great. So tell us a little bit more about what does the world have to say about this gender identity?
Yeah, the common perspective, the common worldview that's really becoming more and more prevalent in our society today is, you could call it gender fluidity. Okay, so gender fluidity is the idea that, okay, your biological sex and your gender that you identify with don't have to be the same thing. It could be different. And they could be different at different times in your life. And beyond that, the gender fluidity approach says that there aren't just 2 genders, male and female, but there's a whole spectrum of genders, from male to female, and maybe some other ones out there too. Mm-hmm. Some people would call themselves agendered. They have no gender. And so, and again, on the spectrum, that people could maybe shift their gender identity at different times in their lifetime. So the gender fluidity approach says that gender is really a cultural construct that's not necessarily identified with facts of our biological nature and our DNA.
Okay, well, that's a pretty interesting concept to add this spectrum into the equation. So what would you say the Bible has to say on this?
Well, there's a few things that I want to point out. Number one is the Bible says God created 2 biological sexes. Okay, in Genesis chapter 1, God said, "Let us create man in our image." And it says God then created man in his image, male and female, he created them. And so those words in Hebrew refer to the 2 biological sexes. God made males, God made females. And so that's the starting point. We'll start with that. This is the biological reality that God made 2 biological sexes.
Okay, so far, there's no incongruence here between a worldly view and a godly view. Okay, so then what does the Bible have to say about gender?
Okay, that's great. So this is where you piece it together, and I think the Bible says that God created 2 genders as well. Okay, because in that Genesis passage, Jesus quotes it later. In Mark chapter 10, verses 6 and 7, someone comes to ask him about divorce, and he quotes the Genesis to talk about God made them, he says, male and female. And then he goes on to say, therefore, a man will take his wife and be united to his wife. They're different sets of words. The male and female are the words describing biological sex, but then he says he made them man and woman, which is a different set of words that talk about their gender. And so the Bible equates the biological sex with the gender. So there's 2 genders. They're different. They're separate, and they're fixed.
Okay. I think there probably is a lot that would say that sin probably factors into this situation. So how exactly is the Bible addressing this?
Yeah, that's a great point, because we all know that the creation isn't the way it was originally made, because human sin and the fall has marred God's original creation. And so death entered into the world. And so all kinds of problems entered into the world, all kinds of human trouble. And so this is where I believe that this transgender idea, the idea of the disconnect between physical sex and gender comes into play, that it wasn't originally God's creation, it wasn't a design, but it's the result of how so much of the world isn't the way it was meant to be. There's so many challenges and so many troubles that have entered the world because of human sin. And we all suffer from those in one way or another. So for example, some people feel like they're at odds between the two, their identified gender and their biological sex. Well, then there's some pain there, there's some challenge there. Well, that's not the way it was meant to be. Just like in other areas of life, there's people who are born with a predisposition to be alcoholics. Well, that's not the way it was meant to be originally. That's a result of the fall. There's all kinds of conditions that have entered the world, mental health issues, physical problems, challenges, diseases that have entered the world because of the fall, but they weren't the way God really made it to work in the first place.
Okay, so we have this idea of God's original creation, the two genders, the two sexes, and sin kind of messing that all up and muddying it up. So ultimately, what does the Bible say about the transgender movement?
Well, the transgender movement is promoting a concept of gender and of human persons that's contrary to the way God has created us. Okay, so so we have this larger worldview question. Then there's particular things where the Bible, it never supports the idea of transgender identity, but on the other hand, rather than supporting it anyway, it actually condemns certain gender crossing practices. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 22:5, it says that men should not dress up like women and women should not dress up like men. Now, you have to admit that there's a lot of cultural flexibility in terms of what constitutes dressing like a man or dressing like a woman. I mean, I know some guys who are manly men who are Scottish, right? And they wear a kilt, right? So, so culture defines a lot of what it looks like to dress like the other. But this underlying principle is that in honoring the two different genders that God has made, then we don't want to confuse the two, because each one of them is good.
I see. Okay, so I guess the last piece in all of this is this idea of this affliction we've talked about, and the sin in the world, and how people are coping with that. And so what does the Bible have to say about that?
Well, I think it's really helpful, Jake, in talking about this, that we understand the Bible makes a distinction between affliction and sin. Okay, so there's certain things that are clearly sinful where we have willfully chosen to go our own way instead of God's way. We've willfully chosen to go against His Word and His truth. But in these gender issues, there is definitely some people who have chosen willfully to go against God. There are other people who they experience this dysphoria, they experience a transgender kind of identity, but they never chose it. As far back as they can remember, they just were drawn to that other identity, or acted or identified with the other parent or whatever, and nobody really knows where this comes from. But as far back as they can remember, this is their experience. And so, and it can be a very challenging, difficult experience for many people. The suicide rate among transgender people is really, really high. And so we want to make a distinction biblically. There are certain things that we can classify as affliction, that we say this is a result, as we said before, of the fallenness of the world. This isn't because somebody made a choice that they were going to shake their fist in the face of God. They're struggling with this. They're trying to figure out what to do with it. And so I think it helps us to interact with transgendered people that we may know if we can make the distinction between affliction and sin that the Bible talks about.
Well, that's great, Ross. We always want to make sure, especially with such a sensitive topic, that we're always keeping in mind the person and being sensitive to their needs. So that is some ways that you can look at the gender dysphoria topic issue from a biblical perspective. So we hope that gives you something to talk about. Be sure to use the article and the questions below, and thanks for watching.